Hey everybody, welcome back to the Go Carolinas podcast. This is Mike Miller, and today we're going to delve into history a little bit. We're going about 45 minutes up the road from Spartanburg to the Kings Mountain National Military Park, which is just outside of Blacksburg, South Carolina. And today I'm here with Head Ranger Robert Holmes. Robert, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, you were telling me just now that you are fairly new here.
Yeah, I've been here for about 3 months. I've been with the Park Service for almost 7 years. It'll be 7 years in March, actually. So I've done a lot of 18th century sites that are related to the American Revolution and many that are, military history of a sort.
Okay, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Oxford, Massachusetts, which most folks haven't heard of, other than the fact it's the birthplace of Clara Barton.
Okay. So where else have you been with the Park Service?
I've been quite a few places, actually. Before I was here, I was down in Florida at the Castillo de San Marcos National Monument. Prior to that, I was doing the special events for the National Mall in Memorial Parks in Washington, D.C. Before that, I was at Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial, which is on a small island located off the coast of Ohio, which is a weird sentence. Prior to that, I was helping them with a officially authorized park in Hartford, Connecticut called the Coltsville National Historical Park, which is authorized but not yet established. And then before that, I was at the Minuteman National Historical Park in Massachusetts, which is the Lexington Concord Battlefields. And finally, my first park was the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, which is also in Massachusetts.
Wow. 7 years, sounds like you've been about the same number of places.
Just about, almost.
Is that by choice, or does the Park Service just send you around wherever they want you to go?
A little bit by choice. Not every park can be open year-round, depending on the weather. The Park Service has several different types of employees. When I began, I was doing seasonal work, which means I was hired for a period of time that lasted about 6 months. And at the end of that term, I would move on to a different park.
Okay. And you were telling me you have a master's degree in history?
Yes. From Villanova University in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Did you have a particular specialty?
Military history, really, would be what the specialty was.
Okay. So you're ideally suited to work here at Kings Mountain then?
Absolutely.
Okay. I guess let's just kind of start and talk a little bit about this place and the battle and what happened here, and then we can talk about the park itself and what visitors can expect. I know the Battle of Kings Mountain was a relatively small battle as far as number of people, but it was really significant as far as the course of the war. And it was one of the battles where there weren't actually a lot of British forces involved.
Yeah, absolutely. On all accounts there. So a little bit of background to get into the battle. We have the root of, what's going to happen here much earlier on in the year when Charleston falls to the British forces in late spring, early summer of 1780. And after that, they're able to very quickly roll up all of the other continental forces in South Carolina and beat down many of the militia forces who were going to resist them. So much so that by the fall, about 6 months later, Lord Cornwallis, the commander of the British forces, is getting ready to invade North Carolina. He's going to split his forces into three. One wing is going to go up to Wilmington. His main force is going to go up to Charlotte under his command. And then he's going to send another force to protect his left flank under Major Patrick Ferguson. And that's the force that's going to end up here at Kings Mountain. As you mentioned, Ferguson's force consisted entirely of loyalists. These are folks who were born or were from the colonies, and when the war broke out, they decided that they were going to remain loyal to their king. And they were going to fight on behalf of the British Empire against folks who were, in some cases, literally their neighbors, other Americans. Ferguson did have a corps of professional troops. These were Americans who were trained as British soldiers. There was about 120 of them, and they came from places like New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. They'd been in the British Army for a couple years at this point, but the rest of his force were local militiamen from the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. And Ferguson sends out a message to the folks of the frontier, the over-the-mountain men and others, And he tells them, surrender, give in, swear your fealty to the king, or I will visit your settlements with fire and the sword. And those over-the-mountain men, those frontiersmen, they did not take too kindly to that threat. So they got together, along with other militiamen from the back country, from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and even Georgia. And they are able to track down Ferguson to Kings Mountain. He knew that they were coming after them, but he didn't know exactly how many of them there were, or where they were. He encamped here at Kings Mountain, about 40 miles away from Charlotte. And while he was encamped here, those patriots, those American militiamen, caught up with him. They surrounded his army on the top of Kings Mountain, and over the course of an hour, they fought their way up to the top of the mountain, killing Ferguson in the process and capturing his entire army. And this was a pivotal American victory. It turned the tide of the war here in South Carolina and helped pave the way for the victory at Yorktown a year and about 2 weeks later. So this was a game changer for the Revolution here in the Carolinas.
Yeah. And what you were saying a couple minutes ago, I've read just enough Revolutionary War history to know that not everyone in the colonies was necessarily on the side of revolution. I guess it was...
Yeah, that's correct. They will say, depending on who you look at, they're going to break it down slightly differently, but roughly figure about a third of the inhabitants supported the revolution, a third of the inhabitants wanted to remain loyal to the king, and a third wanted to remain neutral. They didn't want to have anything to do with either side. They just wanted to go about living their lives. And it's going to depend a bit on which army is where, on who's going to be most active at any given point. So it changes throughout the course of the war.
So the forces, the mountain men you were referring to, they came from what area? Western North Carolina, Tennessee?
A little bit of both, yeah. So the over-the-mountain men, they are going to be the ones who are living around the Blue Ridge Mountains. They're over the mountains. Prior to the war, King George had drew a line through the Appalachians, the Alleghenies, the Blue Ridge, and he prohibited settlement for the colonists west of this line. And those who did so, they settled there illegally, they were referred to as the over-the-mountain men. They're going to come from Western Virginia, Tennessee, Western North Carolina, that sort of area over there, to come to the battle.
And obviously these people didn't have Facebook or email to get organized. And what was the process for this army coming together and knowing they should go to Kings Mountain to have this battle?
Well, at this point, most of these men were members of the militia. They had been involved in innumerable campaigns along the frontier. There was an established militia system dating back decades, almost 100 years to the founding of the colony of Carolina in the 17th century, before they split it into North and South. And they had created a system for defense to protect themselves from Native Americans, the Spanish, and the French. And this system was very well established. Many of these men are going to be veterans of the French and Indian War and conflicts with the Native Americans, like the Cherokee. So when the time came to get ready to fight this battle, they all kind of knew what they were supposed to do. They knew where they were supposed to show up. There were established muster points where all of the men who were liable for militia service were expected to show up to gather with the rest of the soldiers in their company or their unit. So they would send out somebody, either on horseback or on foot, to spread the word amongst all of the communities, to tell them, come to the muster ground at such and such a day, to be ready for this campaign. And everybody would show up. At least in theory, everybody would show up. Can't say that militia service was particularly popular with everybody, and like I said, there were some of those loyalists, but everybody who was liable for militia service was supposed to show up at that muster point. And then they would get together and march to the next muster point, and it would grow from a handful of men to a full company to a regiment as they proceeded further along their march to Kings Mountain.
Okay, so were these guys all more or less volunteers? You said they were supposed to be there. So if you lived in that area, were you expected to be in the militia?
Yeah, every able-bodied man, free man I should say, from the ages of 16 to 60 was liable for militia service. And this meant not only did you have to show up, but you were supposed to bring food, ammunition, your own firearm, your supplies, usually for a period of about 4 days' service. Well, Some people might be sick. Some people might feel that they had other commitments. As I said, some folks were loyalists. So not everybody who was liable was always going to show up. There were some religious exemptions as well for Moravians and Quakers, folks who were known pacifists. And in fact, right prior to the battle, before the battle, there was one Patriot officer who got word that his wife was very ill. So on the very eve of the battle, he requests permission to leave the army so that he can go back and attend to her, which is granted, and he goes and takes care of her, and she thankfully recovers. So it was always going to be kind of a flip of the coin whether everybody who was liable for militia service would actually show up when the call went out.
How far ahead of the battle would this initial call have gone out that created this force?
Sure.
Down to Kings Mountain.
So we're talking about 3 weeks, roughly, prior to the battle. It takes them approximately 2 weeks to march from the furthest muster ground of Abingdon, Virginia, 330 miles down here to Kings Mountain. So it takes a little bit of time. Things move a lot slower back in the 18th
Abingdon,
century
Virginia
than
is
today.
a pretty good haul from here.
It is, yeah. And this is before the roads and the bridges, the things like the interstate that we all take for granted today were in existence. So Kings Mountain National Military Park is not only the site of the Battle of Kings Mountain, this is also the end point of the Over the Mountain National Historic Trail. That route that those militiamen followed from their various points of origin to here at the Battle of Kings Mountain has been preserved by the National Park Service and the various states of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina as the Over the Mountain Victory Trail to commemorate this march to the Battle of Kings Mountain and the victory that was won here.
Okay. And so we've talked about the loyalists for, well, I guess when you use the word loyalist, you're not sure who you're loyal to. Anyway, you have I guess they would be called the Patriots. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have patriots and we have loyalists here. And depending on how you want to think about it, today, to us, the patriots, those are the Americans. The patriots are the ones who are favoring independence. The loyalists are loyal to the British Crown. And you have to remember that when this battle is fought, everybody here is still pretty much a British citizen. The Declaration of Independence was proclaimed and issued in 1776, 4 years earlier, but everybody here was originally a British citizen. So the Patriots were the rebels. They are the ones who are trying to establish independence, while the Loyalists are fighting on the behalf of their government. They're remaining loyal to the Crown.
Okay, so now that I have my terms straight, let's talk about the loyalist forces. How were they assembled and mustered? And
Yeah, so much like the Patriots, they're making use of that pre-existing militia system. Their commander, Major Patrick Ferguson, has been tasked by his overall commander, Lord Cornwallis, and Sir Henry Clinton, who was the supreme British commander in North America, with organizing the militia of South Carolina. When the British came to the Carolinas, they were under the impression that there were more loyalists here than in any other of the 13 colonies. They were expecting that by coming down here, all of these loyalists who hadn't participated in the war to this point would flock to their flag to join the British Army in putting down the Patriots and returning the colonies to the proper allegiance to the British Crown. That didn't exactly happen the way that they were envisioning it would, but Patrick Ferguson, he was made inspector of the militia. So this is essentially appointing him to a position where he's going to be the supreme British commander over all of the militia in South Carolina. So he's spent the last 6 months going around South Carolina, raising loyalist militia forces, training them, organizing them, getting them ready to fight so that they can contribute as part of the British Army. Supposedly, he has trained 4,000 loyalist militiamen at the point that the Battle of Kings Mountain is fought. However, he only has about 1,100 under his direct command. The others are dispersed throughout the colony, guarding other settlements, vital infrastructure like bridges and so on and so forth. So if you were here, you would be hard-pressed to recognize the difference between a loyalist militiaman and a patriot militiaman. They're wearing the same clothing, basically. They've got the same equipment. There's only one way that you can tell the difference, and that's by looking at their hats. If you are a loyalist militiaman, you would have had a sprig of green, like pine, a tree branch, stuck in your hat. Whereas a patriot militiaman is going to have a piece of white paper. Well, as close to white as you can get it. And that's going to be their signifier. Think of it today. If you see soldiers in various different militaries, they're all wearing camo. At first glance, it's going to be kind of difficult to tell whose soldier belongs to what side. You're going to look for that flag patch on their shoulder. In the 18th century, it's the same sort of deal. We think of the British as wearing red coats, but there were soldiers in the French army and in the Spanish army who also wore red coats. They had their sort of insignia on their hat. It was called their cockade. So that was the same sort of idea here. This is where you're going to look for that flag to figure out what side they're on.
Okay. Now, was participation in the Loyalist militia more or less mandatory, or were...
According to Clinton and Cornwallis, it was mandatory. Yeah, that was one of the things that they had done that helped turn the populace against them. After the British occupied Charleston, they issued a series of proclamations, Sir Clinton did, calling on the militia to come out and serve on behalf of their king. So he was requiring them to not just passively support the British cause and fight in the war, but to actively now. He wanted them to come out and actively participate in fighting against men and people who really had been their neighbors. So as a result, a lot of people who were on the fence, that 1/3 of the population who was inclined to stay neutral, were pushed towards the Patriots and pushed towards more actively resisting the British forces in South Carolina. The Loyalists, rather, I should say, also had a distinct disadvantage. They were sort of de-incentivized from fighting the way that the Patriots were. If you are a Patriot militiaman, you're fighting in your colony. You're fighting in your community in its defense. If you are a Loyalist militiaman, however, you are fighting at the pleasure of the king. So you could be called away hundreds of miles to fight in another area, to fight on behalf of your king. That's how you end up with some of these loyalists from places like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, fighting down here in the Carolinas. They're serving at the pleasure of their king. And wherever their king needs them to go, that's where they're going to end up. Unlike the Patriots, who are fighting in their own communities, in their own backyards.
Okay, so would you say that the Patriots were more of a volunteer service than the Loyalists? Were some of the Loyalists kind of pressed into service without really wanting to be there?
In some cases, yeah, absolutely. It really is one of those things that's going to be kind of on a case-by-case basis. It's hard to come up with any hard or fast rules on this. People's loyalties are going to fluctuate, and they're going to be fluid throughout this period, as it's not very clear to them who is going to be coming out on top of this. There's a lot of self-interest here. And quite frankly, just because people were required to do things, if the British soldiers, the professional army, isn't in the area, if they come in and say you have to do this, and then they march away, who's to stay there to make sure that the people are actually going to do what they're supposed to do?
Okay. You said there was basically just one British officer involved in all this?
Yeah, here at the Battle of Kings Mountain there was one British officer, and that was Major Patrick Ferguson. All of the troops under him are Americans. Some of them are professional soldiers, but the majority of them are going to be American militiamen. They are those loyalists.
And as far as British government and administration, what was in place at the time? Was South Carolina still more or less under British government at the time, or kind of in flux?
It really kind of depended on where you were. If you were in one of the strongholds that the British had established, places like 96, places like Camden, places like Charleston, you're going to see all of the trappings of the British colonial rule. That's judges, that's the taxation, that's British soldiers. Outside of those areas, especially the further you go, it's going to become more fluid. there were never enough British soldiers to hold the entirety of the Carolinas. They didn't have enough men. So the further away you are, if your community doesn't have those British soldiers in there, chances are you're not going to run into those British magistrates. You're not going to run into those colonial officers or those British soldiers. So it really kind of depended where you were in the state or in the colony.
Okay. Now, I guess before we get into the actual battle, what's going on in the rest of the Revolutionary War at the time this happens? So say
Sure.
up in the northern areas, Virginia and New Jersey, wherever the other forces would have been.
Well, 1780 is not a particularly great year for the cause of independence.
There were a lot of those.
No, yeah, it's almost a miracle, is the famous book, and it's been said in the past. Yeah. So George Washington's army is going to be encamped in Morristown, New Jersey. Most of us at least, are going to be familiar with the Valley Forge winter and the harsh, horrible conditions that the Continental Army and George Washington suffered under Valley Forge. Morristown was even worse. It was colder. They were even worse supplied, and Washington had to deal with a near mutiny amongst his troops, many of whom felt that their enlistments were up and that they needed to go home. So he had to really come down on them at Morristown to break the back of this mutiny. 1780 is also when Benedict Arnold betrays us. With Major John Andre, he tries to betray the fortress of West Point along the Hudson that was the key to defending Upper New York and linking New York to the New England colonies. Luckily, the plot is foiled, although Benedict Arnold does escape. Elsewhere, this is also going to be when Spain is really making its presence felt, fighting on behalf of its French allies against the British, kind of in support of us. They're going to be attacking British possessions in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico. There's going to be the siege of Pensacola in Florida. You're also got fighting going on in India and in Europe as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on around the world even. In the north, however, of the United States, those northern colonies, it's pretty much a stalemate. George Washington's army and the British forces in New York have created a whole bunch of fortifications, and they just can't get at each other. There's no way that they're going to come up with a decisive victory there, so both sides are looking to take the fight someplace else where they can hopefully achieve a decisive victory.
The British and French just hated each other for a long time, didn't they?
Yeah, they absolutely did. Yeah.
I mean, they had something called the 100 Years' War. You know?
And actually, the American Revolution fits into a period of time that's been called the Second 100 Years' War, a series of conflicts between the French and the British.
So the French weren't really supporting us because they liked the Americans. They just hated the British. Is that more or less accurate?
Pretty much. They wanted revenge for some of the other conflicts. In this Second 100 Years' War between the Brits and the French, which started in 1688 and is going to run till 1815 with Napoleon.
That's a long war.
Yeah, absolutely. The French don't come off well most of the time. This is one of the unique ones where they do pretty well and win, but most of the time they're losing.
Okay. All right, well, we've talked enough. I guess let's talk about the actual battle and how the forces ended up here at Kings Mountain and what actually happened there.
Sure. One of the important things to remember is that neither side was really expecting or planning to fight a battle here. Ferguson is making use of the roads. He's marching back towards Charlotte. He knows that this Patriot force is coming after him. He's trying to get his hands on some cavalry. He's pretty confident that he can win, but without that cavalry, he can't chase down the Patriots, who he expects are going to be running away from him very shortly. So where we are here, we're about 40 miles from Charlotte. There was an old colonial road that ran through the area, and on the top of Kings Mountain was a known hunting encampment. Not that there were really any structures up there, but it was a cleared off area where hunters would pass through and they would make their encampments. There's water. There's a couple springs in the area. So Ferguson takes his army off the road and encamps on the top of Kings Mountain. Like I said, he's not planning to fight a battle here, so he doesn't take any actions to fortify his position. He doesn't circle his wagons. He doesn't make any barricades or anything like that. He's just encamping here because he's expecting he's going to get some reinforcements, and then he's going to march off and crush the Patriots. The Patriots are worried that he's going to escape. They want to catch up to him before he gets to Charlotte. Because if he gets to Charlotte, that's where Lord Cornwallis is with the main British army. So they're riding hard and fast to try and catch up with him. Now, they've got several of their officers who have been in this area before, and they use that local knowledge to sort of sneak up on Ferguson. And the first that Ferguson becomes aware of the Patriot forces in the area is the sound of the guns being fired as his pickets, his sentries, are being shot. The Patriots have dismounted themselves. They were riding on back of horses from the area of Cowpens, where the Cowpens battle will be fought a couple months later. And they dismount about half a mile to a mile away so that they can sneak up on Kings Mountain. And they approach in two columns. They're going to split to go around the mountain to totally encircle Ferguson's force. They want to make sure that he's got no chance to escape. They're going to be fighting in a loose order, spread out, not in the shoulder-to-shoulder style that we think of when we think of 18th century warfare, but spread out in the manner that they would fight during the wars on the frontiers with the Native Americans. Like I said, Ferguson really has no time to prepare, so he is back and forth up there trying to organize a defense. He sends his provincials, his elite professional soldiers, in bayonet charges down Kings Mountain to try and drive off the Patriots, to push them back. Now, this seems kind of like a silly thing for us to do, to us today, but in the 18th century it made sense. Those men charging downhill, they've got 6-foot-long spears. I don't know about you, but if some guy is charging at me, screaming and yelling, with that spear aimed right at my chest, I'm not going to stick around for very long. So the Patriots are chased down the mountain by these bayonet-wielding provincials. They run away, and then when the provincials have to go back up to the top of the mountain, the Patriots turn around and come back. So eventually they're able to fight their way up the mountain. They take the high point on the mountain, the Patriots do, and push Ferguson's loyalists down towards the lower section of Kings Mountain. Again, they're still surrounded. And now the Patriots are able to pour fire into the loyalists, not just from all sides, but also from an elevated position. And at this point, things are really not looking great for the loyalists. Many of them are trying to surrender. They're raising their white flags. Patrick Ferguson is going around. He's swatting those flags down, trying to prevent his men to surrender. Eventually, he realizes this is his do-or-die moment. He gathers what's left of his officer corps. They get mounted on their horses, and they ride directly at the Patriot lines. Now, there's some debate here. Some people will tell you he was trying to escape. Others will tell you that he was trying to break the Patriot line so that the rest of his army would be able to exploit that break and win the battle, go in with one mass charged. Again, it's pretty intimidating when a guy on a horse is riding at you with a sword. However, it doesn't work out too well for him. The Patriots, armed with their accurate flintlock rifles, take aim, and they fire upon him and his officers. 4 of them are dropped, including Patrick Ferguson, who is riddled with 6 bullets. At that point, there's not much else the Loyalists are going to be able to do, so his highest-ranking officer, Captain DePater, is going to surrender the Loyalist forces, what's left of them, at the top of Kings Mountain there. That doesn't immediately end the fighting. Many of these Patriots are enraged at the Loyalists for what they have suffered at their hands. For the last 6 months, these Loyalists have been burning their farms. They've been looting, in some cases executing those suspected of harboring Patriot sentiments. So it takes a little bit of time before the fighting actually stops for the Patriot officers to get control of their men and get them to stop killing these surrendering Loyalist militiamen.
So approximately how many casualties were there?
Yeah. Less than 100 for the Patriots. And, well, you can kind of consider the entire force of Loyalists lost because they were all killed, captured, or wounded.
So in the case of a Revolutionary War thing, what happens to people captured in a battle like that? Obviously, they don't truck them off to a prisoner of war camp because they don't have one.
Believe it or not, they actually tried to do just that.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm incorrect.
At this time, the Continental Army had been driven completely out of South Carolina. They had regrouped at Hillsborough in North Carolina. And the idea was that they were going to try and march these loyalist prisoners to that Continental encampment. Over the course of the previous 6 months, the Continental Army had suffered a string of defeats. And what they would do during the Revolutionary War is they would exchange prisoners. So officers for officers, and possibly enlisted for enlistment, although that was less common. Social class was very much a thing. So with these prisoners, it would have given the Continentals the ability to exchange prisoners for their own soldiers who had been captured at Camden and at Charleston and at elsewhere. However, the Patriot militiamen, being militiamen, they didn't have the greatest discipline. So many of these prisoners were able to just kind of wander off or escape or make their way out. There were something around the order of 750 prisoners taken at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And by the time they get at Hillsborough, they've only got about 135 to 150 prisoners who are left.
Okay.
So most of them are just going to go home, basically.
Okay. I guess they would have had their weapons taken away from them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, that's interesting. So after the battle, the Patriot forces, did they basically just disperse and go back home after this, or were there more battles that they participated in?
So some of them are absolutely going to go home, and I'm thinking specifically of those who we call the over the mountain men. They were always going to be in this for the short term. They were very concerned about threat to their settlements from the Cherokee and other Native Americans, who could very easily, if they were away from home, go in and burn and destroy those settlements. So many of them are going to go home. The backcountry militiamen, those who are not quite as far out there on the frontier as the over-the-mountain men, many of them will participate in later battles, such as Cowpens or Guilford Courthouse, or even Yorktown a year and 2 weeks later.
Yeah, and so how does Kings Mountain fit into the overall American victory?
Sure. So after this defeat, Cornwallis is pretty much forced to give up his invasion of North Carolina. He thought he had South Carolina subdued. He thought he had South Carolina beaten, and that turned out to not be the case. So he's going to have to dispatch another army under Bannister Tarleton to try and salvage the situation. And this is the army that's going to be defeated by Daniel Morgan in January of 1781 at the Battle of Cowpens. And with those two defeats now, Cornwallis has taken very heavy casualties. So his intention has been drawn back to South Carolina. And he's going to try and salvage the situation here. And there will be a number of other skirmishes. But the big thing is that these two victories, Kings Mountain and then later Cowpens, gives the Continental Army time to rebuild, to reorganize, and most critically, it allows Nathaniel Greene to come down here and take command and establish himself. And Nathaniel Greene is going to be the one who's going to lead Cornwallis by the nose for most of 1781 until Cornwallis basically just kind of gives up on really getting anything done in South Carolina or North Carolina and marches up to Virginia and eventually to Yorktown.
Okay. All right. Well, it was pretty a major battle. That's the one thing. I'm not a great historian, but I know if you look at the numbers involved in like Revolutionary War battles versus like the Civil War, I mean it's a lot less people.
Absolutely.
Just as vital. So let's talk a little bit about the park. When was the actual military park established?
Sure. So the park has kind of a long history, believe it or not. It's in the aftermath of the Civil War that people are going to first start thinking like there should be something here. And it starts with 39 acres being set aside in the 19th century as that's going to be the core of Kings Mountain. Of course, this is long before the National Park Service is a thing. So it's not until the 1930s with President Hoover that Kings Mountain National Military Park is created. And originally, it's going to be one giant park that spans the borders of both Kings Mountain National Military Park and the nearby Kings Mountain State Park. By the 1950s, though, they decide, well, this is kind of a big area, so let's divide it up, and we keep the historic section of the battlefield as Kings Mountain National Military Park. And the area that's more focused on recreation will become Kings Mountain State Park. The building here that's behind us is a newer addition. This is our visitor center here. Originally, the park headquarters, which most folks, if you're coming from 85, will be driving past. It's a small stone building. That was the original park visitor center from those early days. This much larger, nicer one has a excellent orientation film and a great museum is going to be built around 1976, the time of the bicentennial.
Okay. Well, I remember seeing, last time I was up here, there was a sign somewhere where they had a 150th, was it, anniversary, and they had like 70,000 people.
Okay. Yeah, so that's from the time when Hoover dedicated the park in the 1930s.
All right.
Yeah, so at that point, it wasn't like today. So radio is really just kind of getting started, right, as a thing. So you can kind of hear the president, but seeing the president, most people aren't going to be able to do that, right? There's no TV, there's no internet or something. So when President Hoover came out here to dedicate the park, people came from miles and miles. And they've got the black and white photographs, and there's just a sea of people, like you said, the 70,000 on the side of Kings Mountain there, who've turned up to see and hear the president dedicate the park. Many more people that were actually involved in the battle, exponentially more.
That's wild. I can't imagine where they would even put 70,000 people.
Yeah, no, so we do have about just under 4,000 acres here.
Okay.
So there's definitely room, but they're coming by train, they're coming by horse, they're coming by bicycle. This is the 1930s. They don't really have the roads or the cars yet. So it's a big deal to get that many people here.
Yeah, I imagine just feeding them and finding various facilities.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Everything else was quite a challenge. So, okay. Tell us a little about the visitor experience if somebody wants to visit the park that hasn't been here before. I know there's a kind of a short loop around the base of the mountain, but tell us about that and other trails.
Sure,
and
yeah.
other experiences.
So whenever you're visiting a national park, not just Kings Mountain National Military Park, but any national park, I'd highly encourage you to start at the visitor center. That's going to be where you get the most up-to-date information about the trails, about what's going on, because sometimes there's demonstrations and there's talks going on. So it's a good place to get yourself started. So here at Kings Mountain National Military Park, once you get yourself oriented at the visitor center, you just go right outside the back door, and it will lead you right to our trail. Now, through this park, we've got kind of two different trails. We have a 1.5 mile long historical trail that takes you through the battlefield and has lots of signs and monuments along that trail that are going to tell you about what happened there, why the battle was fought, and so you can see the different ways that the battle was commemorated. Our earliest monument dates to around 1814, 1815, about 30-something years after the battle is fought, and it's one of the 3 oldest Revolutionary War monuments in the entire United States. It doesn't look like much. If you didn't know what it would just look like a little stone. It's worn quite a bit, but it's one of the things that's well worth seeing on that trail. So the trail is paved with a rubberized mixture, so it's really easy to walk on, or push a stroller, or if you've got somebody in a wheelchair or a power scooter, you're not walking over rocks and roots through mud and puddles and things like that. So it's very, very accessible. However, this is a mountain, as it says in the name, Kings Mountain, so there are a lot of places where the elevation changes, and kind of dramatically, though not as dramatically as you might find in some other mountains. We're only going to be about, just over 1,000 feet tall here at Kings Mountain. So there's an elevation there, but not as bad as you'll find in some places. So that's one trail. That's our historic trail. The other trail is the hiking trail. And this is more of a nature trail. It is 16 miles long,
Wow.
and it takes you through both Kings Mountain National Military Park and the state park. Now, there are different sections of it, depending on which way you want to go. There are shorter sections, and that's what a lot of folks are going to want to go if they're here for that kind of hike and to enjoy the nature. There's one that'll take you from here to the state park, and that's the Lake Crawford Trail. You're looking at a 5.5 mile round trip there, but it'll take you from here to Lake Crawford in the state park, which has got a wonderful nature trail and a little bit of a old mill spillway, so there's a little bit of waterfall action. And then there's the other one that will take you over to Browns Mountain, which is going to be about 1,045 feet in elevation. Pretty nice view. And that's also going to be around 5.5 mile round trip.
Do those both start right here? Or?
Yeah, right here. You just go over to the right,
Okay.
and then there's going to be another fork along the way there, and you stay on one side, it'll take you to Lake Crawford. You stay on the other, it'll take you to Browns Mountain.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I've hiked a little bit at the state park. They've got a ton of trails over there.
Oh, yeah, it's fantastic.
very nice. Okay. All right. Well, Robert, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. That was a lot of good information about Kings Mountain.
Excellent. Hey, it's always a pleasure, and anytime you or your listeners are in the area, stop by, say hi. Having our visitors come through is honestly the best part of the job. You're always welcome here.
Great, great. Thanks a lot. Hey.